When I was 12 years old, my parents sent me to spend the summer with my grandmother. My grandmother lived in this massive 2-story farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Upon my arrival, she led me upstairs to a room at the end of the hall. I had been hoping for a room downstairs, but I was pleasantly surprised to find a room decked out with a television and a brand new Super Nintendo. I was beyond excited. My first night in the old farmhouse was spent playing Super Mario All-Stars and knocking back an entire 12-pack of Mountain Dew. I'd stayed up so late that the sun was coming up when I finally passed out in my bed. Grandma worked as a night manager for a nearby hotel. She let me sleep through the day, and when I woke, she was gone. I found a note on the fridge telling me she'd be back at 6 in the morning and that there was a plate of food in the microwave. I grabbed a couple cans of Mountain Dew from the fridge and carried my plate upstairs so I could play Zelda: A Link to the Past. A few hours passed and I was running around in one of the temples. The music wasn't so much creepy as it was dark, but the combination of the dark music and the fact that it was after midnight and I was alone in the house started to get to me. I decided to head downstairs for more soda. I was about halfway down the hall when I heard footsteps downstairs. I rushed downstairs hoping that my grandmother had come home early. Instead, I saw what looked like an old woman rush past the doorway to the kitchen. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. There was something unnatural about how fast she moved past the door. I was about ready to jump back up the stairs when I heard footsteps upstairs as well. Over the next couple of minutes, I heard the floor creak in different parts of the house as mumbled voices had a conversation I couldn't make out. At this point, I was standing perfectly still, and a single heartbeat away from pissing myself. It was only when I'd heard the stairs creaking behind me that I shot forward, ran down the hall, and raced out of the front door. I was standing in the driveway catching my breath when my bladder started to hurt. I relieved myself and then turned around. I'd left the light on in my room, but the rest of the lights in the house had been turned off when I raced outside. Looking back, nearly all of the lights in the house were on, and there was someone standing in my bedroom window. I had left my glasses upstairs, so I couldn't really make out the face. But even with my myopic eyesight, I could tell there was something very wrong with that face. My eyes drifted to the front bay window where it looked like someone was pacing behind the curtains. It was all too much. Rather than stick around to see what other terrible things were going on in that house, I ran to the barn. The first thing I did as I ran inside the big red building was slam my hand on a switch that caused the fluorescent lights to flicker on. A few of the lights came on instantly, but several of the bulbs were flickering. I stood there trying to catch my breath when one of the lights in the back of the barn let off a shower of sparks as it went out. One by one, the lights either went out or broke as a figure standing about 50 feet away from me became more apparent. It was slowly walking towards me. This almost translucent apparition became more opaque as the lights went out. It raised a single finger to point at me as it got so close that I could almost touch it. Frozen with fear, I stood there screaming in my own head that I had to get out of there. I stumbled back and fell against the barn door, which swung open and allowed me to fall on the gravel. The figure inched closer as I crab walked backwards to get away. I finally regained a bit of composure and rolled over before getting up and running down the driveway. No matter how hard I pushed myself or how fast I ran, the whole time I felt like something was right behind me. I stopped to catch my breath and looked behind me to see the house about 100 yards away in the distance. The lights were on, and something was home. There was no moon out that night, and it was cloudy, but for some reason the entire valley had this faint blue glow. I stood there for a moment taking it all in when I heard the sound of a car engine coming up the narrow driveway. It was my grandmother. She almost wrecked the car as I ran towards it. I climbed in the front seat and begged her to go anywhere else, but she ended up pulling the rest of the way up to the house and turning off the headlights. All the lights in the house were off. I told her about the things that I saw, and she laughed, saying, "No more late nights for you, little boy." I hesitantly followed her into the house, but everything was normal. After telling me that it was probably my overactive imagination and feeding me a few cookies, she took me upstairs and tucked me in. A few hours later, she woke me up and handed me a cup of coffee, saying, "If I can't leave you here at night, you'll have to go back to your parents. So, how about you stay up all day, and tonight you can sleep through the time I'm gone, okay?" I was excited to have been given coffee and drank it as we ate breakfast. She went to her room to sleep. By 7 in the evening, I'd been up all day playing video games and was more than happy to go to sleep before she left. I chalked everything that had happened the night before up to imagination being alone. I'd sleep through the night, and everything would be fine. That night I slept fitfully. I had a nightmare, though, that I remember to this day. I was downstairs playing with a wooden toy horse as my sister played with a sock monkey. My mom was knitting and my dad was out in the field. Suddenly, there were gunshots outside, and a few minutes later, my mom was screaming as these scary-looking men kicked in the front door and carried her and my sister into the other room. One of the men hit me in the face with the butt of his rifle. I laid on the ground in a daze as I heard my mother and sister screaming, as the men in the other room laughed and shouted. I tried to get up to help them, but as I stood, the man who had hit me turned around and fired his rifle. I heard the sound of the gunshot and saw the sparks leave the barrel. And then I felt a hard, thudding pain in my chest and woke up screaming. The clock next to my bed read 12:23 a.m. I tried to fall back asleep, but I couldn't. The events of the dream replayed in my head as the mumbled voices downstairs came back in full force. I heard footsteps creaking up the stairs and the pattering of small feet in the hallway outside my door. I pulled the cover over my head, and for the first time since vacation Bible school a couple of years before, I started praying. It didn't really help. I heard my bedroom door creak open and footsteps across the bedroom. Even without peeking through the covers, I knew someone was standing at the window. I could hear where the footsteps stopped, and I just knew it was that terrible thing from the night before. My mind kept showing me even more terrible versions of what I remembered, until I finally shifted the blanket a little to take a peek. It was standing right over my bed, staring directly at me. This little girl that looked like my sister from the dream stared at me with this pained look on her face that slowly shifted to one of ravenous hunger. She reached her hands towards me, and I could feel the blanket being pulled from me. It was at this point I let out a scream. I didn't wait. I shot out of bed and down the hall. The little girl in my room let out a screech, and I heard the patter of footsteps behind me as I bolted to the stairs. Halfway down the stairs, I saw someone that looked like one of the men with guns from my dream standing at the bottom. I was too scared to stop. I ran right at him and put all my weight into it, falling to the ground and right through him. He brought his rifle up like he was going to hit me with the butt of the gun, but I got up and kept running. I was down the hall and in the living room when I felt a hand grab my arm and yank me to the ground. It was my mom from the dream, but she didn't look like my mother. Her angered expression matched the rage in her eyes as she knocked me to the ground again when I tried to stand up. I saw the breeze blowing from one of the curtains from an open window a few feet away, and when I tried to stand, the next time around I darted for the window and jumped through it, landing in the bushes below it. I let out a loud "ah!" as I hit the brambles below and struggled to my feet before taking off down the gravel driveway barefoot. I felt the same ominous feeling like there was something behind me, but this time I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran until my feet were bloody, and then I kept running. I was somewhere on the main road when my body finally succumbed to the fatigue, and I stopped to rest. I was in a daze by that point. I kind of zoned out after that. Later the next morning, a police officer found me wandering barefoot on a country road in nothing but a pair of boxers. My feet were bleeding, my legs were beyond tired, and I was still freaking out. He ended up taking me to the hospital where I was admitted on a temporary psychiatric evaluation. I tried to tell the doctors and nurses what happened, but no one believed me. Eventually, I was released into my grandmother's care a few days later. Riding in the front seat of my grandmother's car, I dreaded the thought of going back to her house. She took me through the drive-thru at McDonald's before pulling over and letting me eat. After a few minutes, she said, "I'm taking you back to the house." I interrupted, spewing fries from my mouth as I shouted, "No, please, no, anywhere but there." She interrupted my interruption, saying, "Now hold on. Your parents should be here by 5 in the afternoon. We think it best that you go home for a while." I begrudgingly went back with her to the house and waited on the hood of the car until my parents arrived. I wouldn't even go back inside to get my clothes or Super Nintendo. I climbed into the back of my parents' station wagon and sat there staring at the house as they loaded my stuff into the back. Dad started the engine and backed the car up before heading down that gravel road. It was creeping up on 7 at night, and it was starting to get dark. I looked into the field and saw my dad from the dream standing there, as several men with guns ran up on him.